Today we will explore how the people of medieval Europe faced one of the greatest threats to their survival: the long, relentless winters that tested the limits of human endurance. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one, and do not forget to leave your comment at the end. There was an old medieval proverb that said, "Winter devours what summer makes grow." These simple words carried a brutal truth that echoed through villages, castles, and monasteries across Europe. For the men and women who lived in that age, winter was not merely a season, it was a time of trial. The days grew shorter, temperatures plunged, and the fields that had once been green turned into desolate landscapes covered in snow and ice. Survival depended entirely on the ability to prepare during the milder months. Medieval Europe experienced distinct climatic periods that profoundly shaped the lives of its inhabitants. Between approximately 750 and 1350, the continent went through what is known as the medieval warm period, an era of unusually mild temperatures that allowed agricultural expansion and even the cultivation of grapes in parts of England and northern Germany. These favorable conditions brought prosperity and population growth. Yet, as with all things, this abundance would not last forever. Around the year 1300, something began to change. Temperatures started to decline gradually, marking the beginning of a new climatic era. The chroniclers of the time had no name for this phenomenon, but modern historians would call it the Little Ice Age, a period that would last for roughly 4 centuries. In the first years of this transition, the signs were already evident. Winters became harsher, springs arrived later, and summers seemed shorter with each passing decade. The severity of these winters left deep marks on history. In 1303, the Baltic Sea froze completely, an event that would repeat itself in 1306 and 1307. Ships were trapped in ice, and coastal communities found themselves cut off. During the winter of 1363 to 1364, long stretches of the Rhine River remained frozen for consecutive months. Even southern regions did not escape the fury of winter. The Po River in Italy froze so solidly in the winter of 1216 that the inhabitants held a jousting tournament on its surface. In February 1352, Florence remained covered in snow for the entire month, and the accumulation was so great that residents were trapped inside their homes for days. Faced with such conditions, preparation became a matter of life and death. Medieval folk wisdom taught that anyone who failed to prepare during the months of abundance would certainly suffer during the months of scarcity. And so, from spring onward, every household began a long process of accumulating and preserving resources. Wheat and barley were carefully stored in specially prepared granaries designed to protect the grain from dampness and rodents. A common technique was to line the floor of the granary with gorse branches or other thorny plants, raising the grain above the damp ground and making it harder for rats and mice to reach it. The grain preserved during the summer would become the basis of winter nourishment. From it came bread, when mills could still operate, and porridges, when frozen waters made grinding flour impossible. Among these porridges, one dish stood out for its widespread use and remarkable versatility. It was known as fermenti, a word derived from the Latin fermentum, meaning simply grain. This wheat porridge, simple in essence, fed entire generations of Europeans, from the humblest serfs to kings at their banquets. In its most basic form, fermenti consisted of wheat grains boiled in water until soft, then mixed with milk and thickened with egg yolks. The result was a dense, nourishing, comforting dish capable of warming the body and providing energy for frozen days. For peasants, this plain version was often all they had available. For them, the porridge did not need to be beautiful or flavorful. It only needed to satisfy hunger and keep the body warm. At wealthier tables, however, frumenty took on an air of sophistication. Spices imported from distant lands were added to the dish, transforming the humble porridge into a delicacy fit for banquets. Saffron gave it a vibrant golden color, cinnamon added a rich aroma, and sugar softened the flavor of the grains. Some more elaborate recipes called for frumenty to be served with venison broth, or even as an accompaniment to dolphin meat, an ingredient reserved for royalty. In the English cookbook, The Form of Curry, dated to around 1390, there was a recipe suggesting that frumenty be served with porpoise, which the church classified as a fish and therefore allowed on fasting days. The origins of frumenty reach back even further. The Romans already knew a similar preparation, called pulse, a grain porridge eaten by legionary soldiers. Benedictine monks of the early Middle Ages refined the dish, adapting it to the rules of restraint that governed monastic life. For these religious communities, frumenty represented sustenance and simplicity. One of the oldest surviving cookbooks in the French language, Le Viandier de Taïwan, written around 1300, contains detailed instructions for its preparation. The recipe says to take wheat, wash it well, and boil it in water. Once cooked, it should be drained. Then cow's milk is brought to a boil, the wheat is added, and everything is boiled again. Beaten egg yolks are stirred in at the end. Some people added spices and venison broth, but frumenty was only one part of the complex system of winter survival. The preservation of meat was another fundamental pillar. During summer and autumn, animals were fattened for slaughter. Rich pastures and the leftovers of harvests provided abundant feed for pigs, oxen, sheep, and goats. But keeping these animals through the winter would have been economically impossible, because each one represented another mouth to feed from precious grain stores. The Feast of Martinmas, celebrated on November 11th, traditionally marked the beginning of the slaughtering season. On that date, rural communities throughout medieval Europe carried out the mass slaughter of their herds. Only breeding animals and dairy cows were spared, reserved to ensure the continuity of the herds in the following spring. The rest were killed, and the race to preserve the meat began immediately. Salt was the principal preserving agent. Families immersed meat in concentrated brine, or packed it completely in coarse salt, drawing out the moisture that would otherwise allow bacteria to grow. This technique, though effective, had a notable consequence for taste. Salted meat was extremely tough and, as the name suggests, very salty. To make it edible, it had to be boiled for hours before being eaten, a process that softened the fibers and removed some of the excess salt. Smoking offered another option. Sausages and other preserved meats were hung over smoky fires, often from the beams of the house itself. Most medieval homes did not yet have proper chimneys. The smoke from the hearth rose freely toward the roof, escaping through openings in the tiles or the thatch. This smoky environment, though uncomfortable for the inhabitants, was ideal for curing meat hung high in the rafters. Nothing was wasted. Internal organs were turned into preserves. Blood became blood sausages, and black puddings that could last for months in cool places. Intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings, and even fat was carefully saved, since it could be used both for cooking and for waterproofing cloth and leather. Pigs and geese received special treatment. While most animals were slaughtered in November, these two were often spared until December. The reason was simple and practical. In autumn, pigs and geese could feed freely on acorns, worms, and other food found in forests and fields without consuming stored grain. Allowing them to feed for another month meant fatter animals and more meat to preserve. For this reason, December became traditionally associated with pig slaughter, an image that appears in many illuminated medieval calendars. Pork was especially important for poorer households. Oxen were expensive animals, accessible only to the wealthy. Pigs, on the other hand, could be raised by almost any family. These omnivorous animals would eat nearly anything, from scraps to roots and insects. Their ability to turn almost any organic matter into nutritious meat made them indispensable allies in the struggle for survival. And what of fish, one might ask? Surely rivers and lakes offered an alternative source of food. The reality, however, was quite different for most peasants. Under the feudal system that dominated medieval Europe, virtually all land belonged to some lord. And with the land came rights over the rivers, lakes, and streams that crossed it. Fishing was therefore a privilege reserved for nobles and for those to whom they granted permission. Most feudal lords denied this right to their serfs. For those living near the sea, prospects were somewhat better, since the ocean was considered a common resource. But fishing offshore in winter was extremely dangerous. Even so, fish found its way to medieval tables. Herring was salted or pickled for distribution across the continent. But the true champion of preservation was dried cod, known as stockfish. This fish underwent a process of drying and fermentation that made it remarkably durable, capable of lasting for years without spoiling. Its durability, however, came at a price. The fish became so hard and dry that it literally had to be beaten with a hammer before cooking. Even after such treatment, hours of boiling were required to make it remotely edible. The resulting texture was described in distinctly unappetizing ways, even by contemporaries. In the Book of Margery Kempe, an early 15th century work, the author recounts a vision in which Jesus tells her that she would be gnawed by the people of the world, just as a rat gnaws stockfish, and that she would cling to him as tightly as the skin of stockfish sticks to a man's hands when it is boiled. Lent, the 40-day period of abstinence leading up to Easter, which fell mainly during the winter, brought additional difficulties. During this time, the Church forbade the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy products. For the rich, this meant simply replacing meat with expensive fish and elaborate preparations. For the poor, however, Lent could be a time of genuine scarcity. Meat reserves were usually already low by the time Lent began, but losing access to milk, butter, and eggs as well dealt a severe blow to an already limited winter diet. The solution was the use of almond milk or hazelnut milk. These plant-based milks substituted for cow's milk in almost every preparation. Frumenty, made during Lent, used almond milk and was served without egg yolks. In addition to grains and preserved meats, some fresh foods could still survive the colder months. Apples and pears, harvested in autumn and stored in cool, dry places, often lasted until February. Cabbages and leeks could be grown and harvested even during snowy months, their hardy leaves withstanding temperatures that would destroy other vegetables. Radishes also held a special place in the medieval winter diet. Medicine at the time was still based on the theory of the four humors, which classified all things as combinations of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Winter was considered a cold and wet season, and therefore harmful to bodily balance. To counter these effects, people were advised to consume foods considered hot and dry. Radishes fit perfectly into this category. A 13th century scholar known as Bartholomew the Englishman wrote that heat burns the fatty matter of the radish root, and that in winter it is a reservoir of heat that multiplies. Nuts also played a crucial role in winter nourishment. Chestnuts, walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts were gathered in autumn and stored for consumption throughout the winter. During Lent, when so many other foods were forbidden, nuts became even more important, providing fats and proteins that would otherwise have been absent from the diet. Keeping the body fed was only half the battle. Keeping warm was the other half. Castles and manor houses had enormous fireplaces in nearly every room, consuming staggering quantities of firewood. The tapestries hanging on the walls were not merely decorative, they also served as insulation, retaining warmth inside the chambers. Noble clothing consisted of layers of thick wool lined with animal fur, creating a cocoon of warmth around privileged bodies. For peasants, however, the reality was very different. Their homes were simple structures, often with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs that let precious heat escape. A single hearth in the center of the house was all they had to warm the entire family. Their clothing was made of coarse wool, effective enough at retaining heat, but nothing like the comfort of the furs worn by the nobility. Sumptuary laws enacted in various European kingdoms made this inequality even more pronounced. In England in 1363, rules were established determining which fabrics and furs each social class could wear. Even if a prosperous merchant could afford fine furs, the law forbade him from wearing them. These restrictions were not merely about prestige, they had practical consequences during harsh winters. While a noble wrapped in ermine stayed comfortably warm, a peasant in plain wool shivered with cold. Communities developed collective strategies to face the cold. Shared living spaces and even shared beds became common practice. Travelers staying at inns often slept in the same bed as complete strangers, a practical necessity that overrode modesty. In some parts of France and Russia, entire families essentially hibernated together, remaining in bed for weeks and rising only for the most essential tasks. In the French alpine villages, families slept alongside their animals, making use of the body heat of cows and sheep to survive the coldest nights. Extreme cold affected not only human comfort, but the very food supply chain itself. When rivers froze, water mills stopped functioning, making it impossible to grind flour for bread. Without flour, communities were forced to rely on alternatives such as frumenti, which used whole grains boiled rather than ground. Boats that normally transported goods along rivers became immobilized, isolating communities that depended on river trade. An Italian chronicler recorded that during the winter in which the Po River froze, the cold was so intense that bread, apples, pears, and all kinds of food froze solid and could not be cut or eaten until they were warmed and thawed by the fire. Even wine froze inside barrels, and to remove it, people had to use axes to break apart the solid block it had become. Food prices reflected these hardships, with the exception of a few items under government control, such as beer and bread. All other foods became more expensive during winter. In England in the 1340s, the cost of stabling and feeding a horse for one night at an inn was about 1.5 pence in summer, but rose to 3.5 pence in winter. This increase reflected not only food scarcity, but also the higher costs of heating and maintenance in the cold months. Paradoxically, while prices rose, wages fell. The shorter days of winter meant fewer working hours, and workers were paid proportionally less. A tile maker in London in the 1340s earned 5.5 pence a day in summer, but only 4.5 pence in winter. This combination of higher prices and lower wages could force an urban worker to spend more than 70% of his income on food alone during the coldest months. Bartholomew the Englishman captured this reality in a passage that, though originally referring to plants, applied equally well to the finances of ordinary families. He wrote that all things that lived and grew by the benefit of summer wither and die by the cruel harshness of winter. For many families, the savings accumulated during the productive months simply vanished when the cold arrived. This was the reality that made a simple wheat porridge so precious. Frumenti was not merely food. It was a line of defense against hunger and cold. Its preparation was simple enough for any family to manage, and its basic ingredients, wheat, milk, and eggs, were within reach of most people. For those without access to spices or sugar, the plain porridge still provided sustenance. For the more fortunate, additions such as saffron, cinnamon, and other seasonings transformed the humble dish into something worthy of celebration. The thickness of frumenti was especially important. Medieval recipes emphasized that the porridge should be very thick, and this was not simply an aesthetic matter. A thick porridge stayed longer in the stomach, prolonging the feeling of fullness and providing energy for more hours. In a world where meals could be scarce, each dish had to sustain a person as much as possible. The cooked wheat grains kept their individual texture, unlike oatmeal, which becomes a uniform mass. Each grain burst in the mouth when chewed, creating a sensory experience that contemporaries clearly appreciated. The egg yolks gave the dish a creamy richness, while also contributing additional protein and fat. The result was a food that truly stuck to the ribs, as later folk wisdom would put it. The yellowish color of the dish, mentioned in the recipes, was not a decorative whim. In a society that associated vivid colors with quality food, the golden appearance of frumenti signaled nourishment and value. Saffron, when available, intensified this yellow hue, but even egg yolks alone gave the porridge a pleasant color. Peasants, practical in their approach to survival, probably cared little for the color of their food. What mattered was that it warmed the body and held hunger at bay until the next meal. Medieval monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting recipes such as frumenti. Monks produced some of the earliest cookbooks that have survived to our time. Their kitchens served not only religious communities, but also travelers seeking shelter during the winter. The transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age was not abrupt, but its cumulative effects were devastating. Harvests began to fail more often. Famines became more frequent and more severe. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe, a grim prelude to the hardships that were to come. The following decades brought not only cold and hunger, but also the Black Death, which struck a population already weakened by malnutrition and climatic stress. And yet, human resilience prevailed. Food preservation techniques were refined over the centuries. Communities developed mutual support systems that allowed collective survival, even when individuals faced hardship. Simple dishes such as frumenti became symbols of endurance, foods that connected generations through the shared experience of facing and overcoming the hardships of winter. The medieval recipes that survive to this day tell stories of entire civilizations struggling against the forces of nature. Every instruction for cooking grain carries echoes of winters long past. The Little Ice Age eventually gave way to milder climatic conditions. Preservation techniques evolved with the development of modern science. Yet the memory of those difficult times remained inscribed in European culture, appearing in culinary traditions and popular proverbs. Frumenti never disappeared entirely. In some parts of England, versions of the dish continued to be prepared well into the 20th century. Food historians and historical reenactment enthusiasts have rediscovered the recipe and continued to prepare it at living history festivals. The history of winter survival in medieval Europe teaches lessons that go beyond its specific historical setting. The importance of preparing in advance, the need to make the most of available resources, the value of communal cooperation, and the human capacity to adapt to adversity are principles just as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. The men and women who endured those relentless winters had no access to the technologies we now consider basic. What they had was knowledge accumulated across generations, passed from parents to children. That knowledge was their greatest treasure. And so, when we think of frumenty, we should not see it merely as an old-fashioned dish from a distant age. We should recognize in it a symbol of human ingenuity, of the ability to transform simple ingredients into vital sustenance. Every grain of wheat cooked into that thick porridge represents a victory over scarcity. Every bowl eaten beside the warmth of a flickering hearth represents a family that survived long enough to see spring. The medieval proverb was right. Winter truly does devour what summer makes grow. But those who knew how to prepare, who mastered the art of preserving and storing, who shared their resources and knowledge with their communities, these people found ways to endure the darkest months. And when spring finally arrived, bringing with it longer days and gentler temperatures, they emerged ready to plant, raise, and gather once again, continuing the cycle that sustained European civilization through centuries of climatic hardship. History is still being written. The climate changes we face today present new challenges, different from those of the past, but equally serious. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors, not in their specific techniques, but in their attitude of respect toward natural forces and in their determination to adapt and survive. Frumenty may seem too simple a dish to carry such meaning, but it is precisely in that simplicity that its strength lies. It reminds us that, in the end, survival has always depended on humanity's ability to do much with little. If this journey into the medieval past has awakened your curiosity, and you wish to continue exploring fascinating stories like this one, consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us produce more content that connects the present to the past, revealing the stories that shaped our world. Leave a comment sharing what you thought of this narrative, which themes you would like to see explored in the future, or simply your reflections on how our ancestors faced challenges we can barely imagine today. Your participation is the fuel that keeps this project alive, just as frumenty kept generations of Europeans alive during the harshest winters in history. Until the next story.